Kael'thera stood at the observation deck of the Dominion flagship, watching the blue marble of Earth shrink in the distance. His forearms trembled slightly as he gripped the metal railing. The campaign was over. The humans were defeated, but victory felt like poison in his veins. The Zephyrian warrior had served the Galactic Dominion for 3 decades. He had conquered 17 worlds, pacified dozens of rebellious colonies, and earned decorations that covered his chitinous chest. But Earth had been different. The humans had been different. When the Dominion first detected the 3rd planet in the Sol system, intelligence reports suggested a primitive species barely capable of spaceflight. Their technology was crude, their weapons simple projectile-based systems. The analysts predicted complete subjugation within 6 standard cycles. Kael'thera had laughed then, his mandibles clicking in amusement. Another easy conquest for his resume, another species to kneel before Dominion might. How wrong they all had been. The first engagement came near their moon. Dominion forces outnumbered the human fleet 10-1, advanced plasma weaponry against primitive missiles and kinetic rounds. It should have been a massacre favoring the Dominion. Instead, Kael'thera watched in horror as human ships rammed directly into Dominion dreadnoughts. Pilots who could have escaped chose to detonate their vessels inside enemy hulls. They called it kamikaze runs, named after some ancient human tradition of sacrifice. But that was just the beginning. The ground invasion of their largest landmass, a continent they called North America, had started routinely enough. Orbital bombardment softened defensive positions. Dropships deployed Dominion soldiers at strategic points. Standard procedure called for the indigenous population to surrender within days. The humans refused to surrender. Worse, they refused to fight conventionally. Kael'thera remembered the first ambush. His squad was patrolling a ruined city called Detroit when the buildings themselves seemed to explode. Humans had rigged entire structures with explosives, waiting for Dominion forces to take shelter inside before triggering massive demolitions. 12 of his squad mates died in that blast. 12 soldiers with families back on Zephyr Prime, reduced to purple ichor and shattered carapaces because humans preferred mutual destruction over submission. The memory of Sergeant Vexnor still haunted him. The grizzled veteran had survived campaigns against the war-loving Krillians and the savage hive minds of Sector 7. But Earth broke him. Not through superior firepower or tactical brilliance, but through sheer incomprehensible human stubbornness. After the Detroit incident, Dominion Command adapted. They avoided urban areas, focused on rural territories with less infrastructure to weaponize. But the humans adapted faster. Farmers became fighters. Children became spies. Elderly civilians became walking bombs. Every human settlement became a potential trap. Every human face a possible threat. Kael'thera's stomach acids churned as he remembered the school incident. Intelligence had identified a human education facility as a rebel communication hub. Standard procedure demanded its capture for interrogation purposes. The building was surrounded. Demands for surrender broadcast in the local language. The humans responded by having their younglings, their actual offspring, charge Dominion positions with improvised explosive devices strapped to their small bodies. The children couldn't have been more than 10 or 12 years old by human standards. His squad had been forced to choose between dying or killing enemy juveniles. Some Dominion soldiers froze, unable to fire on clearly non-combatant targets. Others opened fire and lived with the consequences. Kael'thera still saw their faces in his dreams. Small, determined, fearless faces running toward certain death because adult humans had convinced them that dying for their species was preferable to living under Dominion rule. The worst part was that it worked. After the school incident, Dominion morale plummeted. Soldiers began requesting transfers. Some deserted entirely. Others suffered complete psychological breaks and had to be medically evacuated. The humans seemed to understand this effect and deliberately escalated their tactics. Pregnant females used their condition to get close to Dominion checkpoints before detonating concealed explosives. Medical personnel poisoned wounded Dominion soldiers instead of treating them. Religious leaders preached sermons that doubled as tactical briefings for suicide attacks. Every human appeared willing to die, and more importantly, willing to take Dominion soldiers with them. Command eventually authorized the use of biological weapons. If humans insisted on fighting to the last individual, the Dominion would accommodate them. Airborne pathogens designed to target human physiology were deployed across major population centers. The humans adapted again. They sealed themselves in underground bunkers, wearing primitive but effective protective gear. They continued fighting even as their bodies succumbed to engineered diseases. Some humans deliberately infected themselves and then sought close contact with Dominion forces, turning their dying bodies into biological weapons. Kael'thera had personally witnessed human soldiers in the final stages of hemorrhagic fever, attempting to bite Dominion troops, hoping to spread the infection to species it wasn't designed to affect. The final phase of the campaign lasted 8 months longer than projected. When human resistance finally collapsed, it wasn't from military defeat, but from simple extinction. The last human stronghold fell not because its defenders surrendered, but because there were no longer enough humans left alive to maintain meaningful resistance. Dominion forces found empty cities filled with booby traps. Automated systems continued broadcasting human propaganda weeks after the last confirmed human death. Even their corpses were weaponized, rigged with explosives to kill any Dominion soldier attempting to verify casualties. Standing now on the observation deck, Kael'thera realized that the Dominion had won the war but lost something else. Every Dominion soldier who served on Earth returned changed. The easy confidence that came from technological superiority was gone, replaced by a nagging doubt about what other primitive species might be capable of when cornered. The humans had taught the galaxy a terrifying lesson about the price of conquest. Sometimes the cost of victory could be higher than the price of defeat. Kael'thera closed his eyes and tried to forget the human face that haunted him most. A young human female, maybe 25 by their standards, who had looked him directly in the eyes as she triggered the explosive vest that killed 3 of his squad mates. She hadn't shown fear or hatred in those final moments. She had smiled. That smile followed him everywhere now, a reminder that the Dominion's greatest victory might also be its most Pyrrhic defeat. The humans were gone, but their example remained. Word would spread to other species about how a primitive world had made the mighty Dominion bleed. And somewhere in the galaxy, other species would start asking themselves a dangerous question. If humans could make the Dominion pay such a price for conquest, what might they accomplish? 3 months after leaving Earth's solar system, Kael'thera found himself assigned to the Dominion garrison on Nexus Station, the administrative heart of the Outer Rim territories. It was supposed to be a peaceful posting, a chance for veterans to recover from the trauma of the Earth campaign. But peace proved elusive when your dreams were filled with human voices. The nightmares started small. Fragments of memory that surfaced during meditation cycles, the sound of human aircraft engines, the smell of their burning cities. The way their blood looked different from any other species, red instead of the blues and purples and greens that filled most battlefields. Kael'thera tried to focus on routine duties, processing refugee applications, reviewing trade disputes, maintaining order among the dozens of species that called Nexus Station home. Simple administrative work that should have been boring enough to quiet his mind. Instead, every human-like species triggered flashbacks. The Altarians were bipedal with similar proportions to humans. The Centauran colonists had 5-fingered hands and forward-facing eyes. Even the artificial intelligences with holographic human avatars made his mandibles lock with anxiety. Dr. Yel'Saran, the station's chief psychological officer, insisted the condition was treatable. Post-conquest stress syndrome affected many soldiers. Standard therapy involved memory suppression treatments and chemical mood stabilizers. But Kael'thera's symptoms were different. Instead of forgetting traumatic events, he remembered them with perfect clarity. Every detail, every sound, every smell from Earth remained vivid in his consciousness. The problem wasn't remembering too little. It was remembering too much. During his first therapy session, Dr. Yel'Saran asked him to describe his worst memory from Earth. "There are too many," Kael'thera replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "They just keep coming. Focus on one specific incident. The therapeutic process works best when we isolate individual trauma events." Kael'thera closed his eyes and immediately saw the subway tunnels beneath the human city of New York. His unit had been tasked with clearing underground transit systems that humans were using to move supplies and personnel. The tunnels were dark, cramped, filled with the stench of human fear and desperation. Perfect ambush territory. Command had warned them about human tunnel tactics, but nothing could have prepared them for what they actually encountered. The humans had turned their underground transportation network into a death maze. Every tunnel entrance was booby-trapped. Every platform contained hidden firing positions. Every train car had been converted into a mobile bomb. But the worst part was the children, human younglings. Some barely old enough to walk, had been stationed at key intersection points with simple instructions. When they saw Dominion soldiers, activate the explosives strapped to their small bodies. The humans had given their offspring stuffed toys that doubled as detonators. Colorful playthings that would seem harmless to any reasonable species but served as triggers for massive underground explosions. Kael'thera's unit had been forced to treat every human child as a potential threat. Soldiers who had never harmed a juvenile of any species were suddenly shooting at beings who should have been in protective custody. We tried to stun them instead of killing them, Kael'thera told Dr. Yelsaran. Our weapons have non-lethal settings specifically designed for crowd control and civilian pacification. That sounds like appropriate restraint under the circumstances. The stunned children still triggered their explosives. Even unconscious, their dead man switches activated. The humans had engineered the devices to detonate if the child's vital signs stopped registering normal patterns. Dr. Yelsaran made notes on her electronic tablet. The humans clearly violated every civilized convention regarding the protection of juveniles during warfare. That's not what bothers me, Kael'thera said. What bothers me is that their tactics worked. We couldn't advance through those tunnels without massive casualties. Eventually, Command ordered us to flood the entire system with nerve gas rather than risk more ground troops. A logical tactical decision given the circumstances. Logical, yes. But the humans kept fighting even while dying from chemical weapons. Parents used their final breaths to activate more explosives. Children who were already convulsing from nerve toxins still managed to detonate their devices with their last conscious movements. The therapy session continued for 2 hours. But Kael'thera felt no better afterward. If anything, discussing the memories made them more vivid, more present in his daily consciousness. Over the following weeks, his condition worsened. He began seeing human faces in crowds of aliens, hearing human voices in station announcements, smelling human blood in the recycled air of the environmental systems. Other Earth veterans at Nexus Station were experiencing similar symptoms. The commissary had to ban discussion of the Earth campaign after several fights broke out between soldiers who disagreed about human tactics. Some veterans insisted the humans were savage monsters who deserved extinction. Others argued that human behavior demonstrated a kind of courage that the Dominion should respect. Kael'thera found himself in a third category, soldiers who were terrified by the implications of human resistance. If a primitive species could inflict such psychological damage on Dominion forces, what did that say about the Dominion's military superiority? What happened when the galaxy's other species learned about human tactics and decided to adopt them? The answer came sooner than expected. Reports began filtering in from frontier territories about unusual resistance patterns among subjugated populations. Species that had previously accepted Dominion rule were suddenly organizing suicide attacks against garrison forces. Civilian populations were adopting human-style tactics, using children as weapons, converting medical facilities into bomb-making centers, treating every social gathering as a potential military operation. The human example was spreading like a virus throughout the galaxy. On Kepler 7, the native Aquarians had started drowning themselves in their planet's oceans, rather than submit to Dominion taxation. But first they filled their bodies with industrial toxins that poisoned the water supply for Dominion bases. On Rigel Minor, the crystalline life forms had begun shattering themselves against Dominion installations, using their razor-sharp remains as improvised shrapnel weapons. Even the Pacifist Harmony Collective had started incorporating human tactics, using their telepathic abilities to drive Dominion soldiers insane during what appeared to be peaceful surrender negotiations. The pattern was always the same: formerly compliant species suddenly willing to accept massive casualties in exchange for inflicting even minimal damage on Dominion forces. Intelligence reports confirmed what Kael'thera had feared. Human final transmissions broadcast during the last days of their resistance had been intercepted and studied by dozens of alien species. The humans had basically created an instruction manual for guerrilla warfare, complete with psychological tactics designed to break occupation forces. Their final gift to the galaxy was a blueprint for making conquest too expensive to sustain. Kael'thera realized that Earth hadn't been a victory at all. It had been a trap. The humans had sacrificed their entire species to plant an idea in the galactic consciousness that any species, no matter how primitive, could make an empire pay a devastating price for aggression. And now that idea was spreading faster than the Dominion could contain it. Sitting in his quarters on Nexus Station, surrounded by reports of growing unrest across a dozen systems, Kael'thera understood that the humans had won after all. They had lost the war but won something more important. They had taught the galaxy how to resist. The Dominion would survive, but it would never again be the same confident, expanding empire that had once seemed destined to rule every inhabited world. The humans had introduced doubt, fear, and hesitation into the imperial mindset. And doubt, as any military strategist knew, was more dangerous than any weapon. 6 months after the Earth campaign, Kael'thera received orders that made his blood run cold. The Dominion High Command was assembling a new expeditionary force to pacify the growing unrest in the Outer Rim territories. As one of the few surviving veterans from Earth, his experience was considered invaluable for dealing with human-inspired resistance tactics. The briefing room on Nexus Station buzzed with nervous energy as officers from dozens of species gathered to discuss the deteriorating situation. Admiral Jexvara, a massive insectoid with compound eyes that reflected rainbow patterns, stood before a holographic display showing rebellion hotspots across the galaxy. "The contamination spreads faster than our intelligence networks can track," the Admiral announced. 17 systems now show active resistance patterns directly modeled on human tactics. The economic impact alone threatens to bankrupt our expansion protocols. Kael'thera studied the data streams floating in the air before him. Each red dot represented a world where formerly peaceful species had suddenly adopted suicidal resistance methods. The pattern was unmistakable and terrifying. On Vega Prime, the gaseous ethereals had started compressing themselves into explosive clouds that could demolish entire city blocks. Their previous culture had been built around aesthetic contemplation and mathematical harmony. Now they were weaponizing their own physiology. The mining colonies on asteroid belt Sigma 9 had seen the rock-eating silicates begin swallowing refined metals and then detonating their digestive systems near Dominion equipment. Centuries of peaceful cooperation had ended when the silicates discovered human broadcast recordings. But the worst reports came from Harmony 7, where the telepathic collective had begun, something they called mind bombing. Groups of their people would focus their combined psychic energy and literally burn out their own neural networks while in contact with Dominion personnel. The resulting psychic feedback loop left both attackers and targets in permanent vegetative states. Lieutenant Kael'thera, Admiral Jexvara's multiple eyes focused on him simultaneously. "Your first-hand experience with human tactics makes you our most valuable tactical consultant. What recommendations do you have for countering these new resistance patterns?" Kael'thera stood slowly, feeling the weight of every gaze in the room. These officers expected him to provide solutions, strategies that would restore Dominion military superiority. But the truth was more complicated than they wanted to hear. The human tactics succeed because they're based on a fundamental misunderstanding of imperial psychology, he began carefully. Every Dominion military doctrine assumes that rational beings will choose survival over principle when faced with overwhelming force. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the assembled officers. This was basic strategic thinking, taught in every military academy across Dominion space. The humans taught other species that this assumption is wrong. They demonstrated that a population willing to accept total extinction can inflict unacceptable costs on any occupying force, regardless of technological disparity. "So we adjust our tactics accordingly," growled General Crixmoth, a carnivorous reptilian whose species had joined the Dominion, specifically for access to better hunting grounds. "We simply increase our willingness to accept casualties and continue operations." Respectfully, "General, that approach misses the point entirely." Kael'thera pulled up his own tactical displays, showing casualty projections from the Earth campaign. Human resistance wasn't effective because it killed Dominion soldiers. It was effective because it forced us to kill in ways that violated our own cultural values. The room fell silent. This was dangerous territory. Questioning the moral foundation of imperial expansion could be considered treasonous under Dominion law. Explain, Admiral HFY commanded. Every Dominion species joined the Empire voluntarily because our expansion policies promised protection for civilian populations, preservation of local cultures, and economic benefits for conquered territories. We built our legitimacy on being different from the savage empires of the past. Calthera activated a holographic recording from Earth, showing the aftermath of a human suicide bombing that had targeted a Dominion field hospital. The images were horrific. Medical personnel and wounded soldiers scattered across cratered ground. The humans forced us to bomb schools, poison water supplies, and treat every civilian as a potential combatant. By the end of the Earth campaign, we were behaving like the brutal conquerors our propaganda insisted we weren't. Commander Veltaris, a graceful aquatic species known for their philosophical approach to warfare, raised a webbed appendage. Are you suggesting that human tactics corrupted our forces? I'm suggesting that human tactics revealed contradictions in our imperial model that other species are now exploiting. When the ethereals of Vega Prime compress themselves into explosive clouds, they're not just killing our soldiers. They're forcing us to develop weapons specifically designed to slaughter gaseous life forms. Every tactical adaptation we make to counter their resistance methods moves us further from the benevolent empire we claim to be. The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Finally, Admiral HFY spoke. What do you recommend as an alternative approach? Calthera had been dreading this question because he knew his answer would be considered heretical. But months of nightmares and sleepless cycles had led him to an unavoidable conclusion. We should consider strategic withdrawal from contested territories and focus on voluntary integration rather than forced conquest. The room exploded. Officers shouted over each other in a dozen different languages. General Cricksmoth's snarl was so loud it overwhelmed the translation systems. Commander Veltaris looked genuinely shocked. Admiral HFY's compound eyes dimmed to nearly black. Lieutenant, the Admiral's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. Are you seriously recommending that the Dominion abandon its expansion protocols because primitive species learned how to commit more effective suicide? I'm recommending that we recognize the Earth campaign as a strategic defeat, disguised as a tactical victory. The humans accomplished their primary objective, which wasn't to survive, it was to prove that resistance was possible. Calthera knew he was ending his military career with every word, but he continued anyway. Every species watching our broadcast from Earth learned that the mighty Dominion could be made to suffer. They learned that technological superiority means nothing when your enemy is willing to die in ways you're not willing to kill. The Dominion does not negotiate with terrorists, General Cricksmoth snarled. The humans weren't terrorists. They were a species fighting for survival, using the only tactics that worked against superior force. And now every other species in the galaxy has those same tactics. Calthera pulled up a strategic projection, showing the expanding pattern of resistance across Dominion space. In 2 standard years, we'll be facing active rebellion in 40% of our territories. In 5 years, maintaining imperial control will cost more resources than those territories generate. The humans didn't just die for their freedom, they made freedom economically viable for everyone else. Admiral HFY studied the projections with her multiple eyes moving in complex patterns that indicated deep thought. Even if your analysis is correct, Lieutenant, the Dominion cannot simply abandon its imperial structure. Too many species depend on our protection and economic integration. Then we offer them true partnership instead of subjugation. We become a federation instead of an empire. We prove that cooperation is more profitable than conquest. And if they refuse, if they prefer their new suicide tactics to peaceful integration? Calthera looked around the room at faces representing dozens of worlds, each shaped by different evolutionary pressures, but all united in their commitment to Dominion expansion. These weren't evil beings, they were products of a system that had worked for centuries but was now facing its first existential challenge. Then we learn to live with smaller borders and cleaner consciences, he said quietly, because the alternative is becoming the monsters that humans died to warn the galaxy about. The briefing ended with Calthera under formal review for defeatist statements unbefitting a Dominion officer. But as he was escorted to his quarters to await disciplinary proceedings, he noticed something interesting in the faces of his colleagues. Fear was being replaced by thoughtfulness. Anger was giving way to careful consideration. For the first time since Earth, Dominion officers were asking themselves whether victory was worth any price. The humans had planted one more seed in the galactic consciousness, doubt about the righteousness of conquest itself, and doubt, as Kelthera now understood, was the beginning of wisdom. The disciplinary hearing lasted 3 standard days and changed the course of galactic history. Kelthera sat before a tribunal of 5 senior officers, each representing a different branch of Dominion military hierarchy. Fleet Admiral Yexandra presided, her crystalline features reflecting the cold light of the station's artificial suns. To her left sat General Morthak of the ground forces, his massive frame barely fitting in the regulation chair. To her right, Intelligence Director Pelsava's multiple tentacles moved in patterns that suggested deep analytical thought. The charges were serious: defeatist conduct, undermining military morale, and spreading seditious propaganda among active personnel. Any one of them could result in imprisonment or exile to frontier mining colonies. But something unexpected happened during the testimony phase. As Kelthera described the tactical evolution of human resistance, providing detailed analysis of their psychological warfare methods, the tribunal began asking questions that had nothing to do with his alleged crimes. Lieutenant, Director Pelsava leaned forward, her tentacles stilling. You mentioned that human final broadcasts contained specific instructions for other species. Have you reviewed these transmissions personally? Yes, Director. Command required all Earth veterans to study the materials for intelligence purposes. And what was your assessment of their strategic value? Kelthara paused, sensing that his answer would determine more than his own fate. The humans created a comprehensive handbook for asymmetric warfare against technologically superior forces. But more than that, they developed a philosophical framework that redefined the relationship between conquest and resistance. Elaborate. Previous. Resistance movements focused on military victory, defeating the enemy and driving them away. Human resistance was designed around victory through moral transformation, forcing the enemy to become something they couldn't live with being. General Morthak's growl interrupted the proceedings. Philosophical nonsense. Military victory is achieved through superior force application. Nothing more. Respectfully, General. The current rebellion statistics suggest otherwise. Kelthara activated his personal datapad, displaying the intelligence reports that had been circulating through command channels. 17 systems now in active revolt. Economic output from conquered territories down 43%. Military recruitment rates falling as species witness our superior force application against civilian populations. Admiral Yexandra's crystalline features shifted. Colors, a sign of emotional disturbance among her species. Are you suggesting that military force is no longer viable for maintaining imperial order? I'm suggesting that the humans redefined what victory means. They proved that a species could win by making conquest more expensive than abandonment. Every other species in the galaxy learned that lesson. Director Pelsava's tentacles began moving again, this time in the rapid pattern that indicated urgent calculation. Our intelligence networks report that human tactical manuals are being distributed through underground networks on 47 different worlds. Species that have never had contact with Earth are somehow accessing detailed instructions for anti-imperial resistance. The humans seeded their tactics throughout the galactic communication networks. Before their final extinction, Kelthara confirmed, they embedded the information in entertainment broadcasts, trade communications, even scientific research papers. Any species with basic technology can access their resistance protocols. This tribunal is not concerned with the distribution methods of human propaganda, General Morthak snarled. We're here to determine whether Lieutenant Kelthara violated his oath of service by recommending retreat in the face of inferior enemies. But Fleet Admiral Yexandra held up a hand for silence. Actually, General, I think this testimony is highly relevant to our current strategic challenges. Lieutenant, if you were tasked with developing countermeasures to human-inspired resistance tactics, what would you recommend? This was the moment Kelthara had been preparing for since his arrest. His answer would either validate everything He'd argued or confirm his reputation as a defeatist, coward. The human tactics cannot be countered through military force, because they're not actually military tactics. They're cultural weapons designed to exploit the psychological vulnerabilities of conquest-based societies. Explain. Every imperial species in the Dominion joined our alliance because we promised them something better than endless warfare: protection, prosperity, technological advancement, cultural preservation. We built our legitimacy on being different from the savage empires of the past. Kalthara stood and began pacing, his forearms gesturing as he organized his thoughts. Human resistance tactics force imperial forces to behave in ways that contradict those founding principles. When we're forced to bomb schools or poison water supplies, we destroy the moral foundation that justifies our existence. And your recommended countermeasures? Director Pelsava prompted. There are no effective countermeasures because the humans designed their tactics to exploit fundamental contradictions in our imperial model. You cannot maintain the moral authority to rule while engaging in the brutal tactics necessary to suppress human-style resistance. The silence that followed was different from the hostile quiet of previous proceedings. This was the silence of beings grappling with uncomfortable truths. Finally, Fleet Admiral Yexandra spoke. Are you recommending that the Dominion abandon its imperial structure entirely? I'm recommending that we evolve into something that humans couldn't turn into monsters. A federation of equals instead of an empire of subjects. A cooperative alliance instead of a conquest-based hierarchy. General Morthak's laugh was bitter and harsh. Idealistic nonsense. The galaxy is full of species that only understand strength. Without imperial authority, we'd face constant warfare between competing factions. The galaxy is full of species that fear conquest more than they value cooperation, Kalthara corrected. But the humans proved that conquest is no longer economically viable. We can either adapt to that reality or be destroyed by it. Director Pelsava activated her own data displays, showing economic projections based on current rebellion trends. The mathematics support Lieutenant Kalthara's analysis. If resistance patterns continue expanding at current rates, maintaining imperial control will cost more resources than conquered territories generate within 18 standard months. Then we increase efficiency of pacification operations, General Morthak insisted. More effective weapons, faster response times, overwhelming force deployment. General, Fleet Admiral Yexandra's voice carried the weight of command authority. You're describing exactly the tactical escalation that transforms us into the brutal conquerors we've always claimed not to be. Lieutenant Kalthara's point stands. Human tactics force us to choose between abandoning our imperial structure or abandoning our imperial values. The tribunal recessed for deliberation, leaving Kalthara alone with his thoughts and the growing certainty that the galaxy was approaching a historical turning point. The humans had done more than resist conquest. They had created a logical framework that made conquest itself unsustainable. When the tribunal reconvened 3 hours later, Fleet Admiral Yexandra delivered a verdict that surprised everyone present. Lieutenant Kalthara, this tribunal finds you guilty of violating military protocol by publicly questioning established strategic doctrine. However, we also find that your analysis of current galactic conditions demonstrates exceptional strategic insight that serves the best interests of Dominion security. Kalthara felt confusion wash over him. I don't understand, Admiral. You're hereby promoted to Strategic Analyst First Class and assigned to a special commission tasked with developing alternatives to traditional imperial expansion. Your new mission is to design a post-conquest model for galactic governance that addresses the challenges posed by human tactical innovations. General Morthak stood abruptly. This is unprecedented and dangerous. We're rewarding defeatism and undermining military discipline. We're adapting to new realities, Fleet Admiral Yexandra replied firmly. The humans taught us that some victories cost more than defeats. Now we need to learn how to achieve our objectives without winning battles that destroy the values we're fighting to preserve. As Kalthara accepted his new assignment, he realized that the humans had achieved something remarkable. They had forced their conquerors to evolve, to become something better than they had been before. The price of that evolution was the extinction of humanity itself. But their sacrifice was creating possibilities that hadn't existed before. The possibility of a galaxy governed by cooperation rather than conquest. It was, Kalthara thought, exactly what humans would have wanted. a universe where their deaths made life better for everyone else. 1 year after his promotion to strategic analyst, Kalthara found himself standing in the same observation deck where his nightmares had begun, but this time he wasn't alone. Representatives from 23 different species filled the chamber, their varied forms creating a living tapestry of galactic diversity. They had come to witness something unprecedented in recorded history, the formal transformation of an empire into a federation. The Dominion Council had spent 8 months debating Kalthara's proposals for post-imperial governance. His cooperative hegemony model had been dissected, criticized, modified, and ultimately accepted as the only viable alternative to endless warfare against human-inspired resistance movements. But implementation was proving more complex than theory. The Rigelian collective refuses to accept Federation status, reported Ambassador Thex Mira, her serpentine form coiled around the speaking platform. They insist that their recent adoption of human tactics has proven their military viability. They demand full independence rather than cooperative membership. Kalthara studied the holographic displays showing current resistance activities across Dominion space. The Rigelians had indeed become formidable opponents, using their natural shape-shifting abilities to create devastating infiltration attacks. But their success was creating new problems. Independence would destabilize the entire region, he replied carefully. The Rigelian system controls 3 major trade routes. If they withdraw from cooperative governance, it creates a power vacuum that the Catherian Empire might exploit. Director Pelsava's tentacles writhed in patterns indicating frustration. This is precisely the challenge we anticipated. Human tactics didn't just teach species how to resist conquest. They taught them to believe that resistance was always preferable to cooperation. The irony wasn't lost on Kalthara. The humans had been so effective at inspiring resistance that some species now rejected even voluntary association with their former conquerors. The Federation model only worked if beings could distinguish between forced submission and chosen partnership. What about the economic incentives? Asked Commander Velteris, her aquatic voice bubbling through the translation system. Surely the Rigelians understand that cooperative membership provides access to technologies and markets they can't develop independently. They understand the benefits, Ambassador Thex Mira replied. But they've concluded that psychological independence is worth economic disadvantage. The human example taught them that some things are more valuable than prosperity. Kalthara felt a familiar chill as he recognized the echo of human philosophy and Rigelian demands. The species that had inspired galactic resistance was continuing to influence galactic politics even after extinction. We need to address the underlying trust deficit, he said finally. The Rigelians, like most former subjects, don't believe that the Dominion has genuinely abandoned imperial ambitions. They see Federation membership as conquest by other means. Fleet Admiral Yexandra's crystalline features shifted through several color patterns before settling on deep blue, her species' equivalent of thoughtful concern. How do we prove to them that our transformation is genuine? We demonstrate it through sacrifice, Kalthara replied. The humans taught the galaxy that true commitment requires accepting costs that pure self-interest would reject. If we want former subjects to trust our Federation model, we need to prove that we're willing to accept disadvantages for the sake of cooperative principles. What kind of disadvantages? General Morthak growled. The old warrior had become surprisingly supportive of Federation policies once he'd seen the casualty projections for continued imperial expansion. Kalthara activated his tactical displays, showing proposed adjustments to Federation structure. We grant the Rigelians everything they're demanding: full independence, withdrawal of all Dominion personnel from their system, and formal recognition of their sovereign status. But we also offer them a partnership treaty that provides all the benefits of Federation membership without any of the obligations. The chamber erupted in protests from multiple species simultaneously. The translation systems couldn't keep pace with the overlapping arguments. That's completely unsustainable. Director Pelsava managed to make herself heard above the chaos. If we grant those terms to the Rigelians, every other system will demand similar arrangements. We'll have all the costs of Federation with none of the benefits of centralized coordination. Exactly, Kalthara nodded. We'll be demonstrating that Federation membership is genuinely voluntary by accepting the possibility that nobody will choose it. That's not governance. That's national suicide, General Morthak snarled. It's what the humans did, Kalthera replied quietly. They chose principles over survival and inspired the galaxy in the process. If we want to build a post-imperial order based on cooperation rather than conquest, we need to prove that we value cooperative principles more than cooperative benefits. Fleet Admiral Yexandra studied the economic projections floating in the chamber's center. The mathematics are concerning, but the strategic logic is sound. If species believe that Federation membership is voluntary in name only, they'll continue adopting human resistance tactics. But if we demonstrate genuine commitment to voluntary association, they might choose cooperation over resistance, Kalthara finished. The humans taught everyone that forced cooperation is ultimately impossible. But they also demonstrated the power of chosen sacrifice for shared principles. Commander Veltaris raised a webbed appendage. What if they still choose independence? What if offering genuine choice results in the complete dissolution of any galactic governance structure? Kalthara had spent months contemplating that possibility. His answer came from the deepest lessons he'd learned during the Earth campaign. Then the galaxy will be better off without us. The Dominion existed to provide stability, security, and prosperity for inhabited worlds. If those worlds can achieve those goals independently, then our mission was successful even if our organization becomes unnecessary. The silence that followed was profound. Kalthara could see beings from dozens of different species processing the implications of his statement. He was proposing that the Dominion judge its success not by its own survival, but by its ability to make itself unnecessary. The human precedent supports this approach, Director Pelsava said slowly. They defined victory as achieving their values rather than preserving their existence. If we adopt similar metrics, we transform from conquerors into gardeners. Fleet Admiral Yexandra completed the thought. Our success is measured by the flourishing of galactic civilization, not by our control over it. General Morthak's laugh was still harsh, but no longer bitter. You're asking career soldiers to find purpose in working ourselves out of jobs. I'm asking them to find purpose in creating a galaxy that doesn't need soldiers, Kalthera corrected. The humans showed us that forced peace is unstable and expensive. But they also showed us that beings will sacrifice everything for principles they believe in. If we can inspire belief in cooperative principles, we create a foundation for lasting peace based on shared values rather than shared fears. Ambassador Thex Mira completed his thought. The vote to implement the Rigelian Protocol was closer than Kalthara had hoped, but wider than he'd expected. 15 species voted in favor, 7 opposed, with 1 abstention. Not an overwhelming mandate, but enough to begin the most ambitious political experiment in galactic history. 3 months later, the Rigelian Collective announced their acceptance of the Partnership Treaty. Full independence, but voluntary cooperation on trade, defense, and technological development. Other species began requesting similar arrangements. The Dominion was dissolving itself by choice, transforming into something that had never existed before. A voluntary association of equals united by shared principles rather than shared fears. Standing once again on the observation deck, watching ships from dozens of independent worlds coming and going freely from Federation space, Kalthara realized that the humans had achieved their ultimate victory. They had forced their conquerors not just to become better, but to become something entirely new. The galaxy was learning to cooperate not because cooperation was enforced, but because cooperation was chosen. The price had been the extinction of humanity. But the result was a universe where human values, freedom, dignity, chosen sacrifice for shared principles, were becoming the foundation of galactic civilization. It was, Kalthara thought, exactly what humans would have built if they had lived to see it. 5 years after the Earth campaign, Kalthara stood in a place he never thought he would see again. The ruins of New York City, on the world that had changed everything. The Terran Restoration Project was the Federation's first major collaborative effort. 37 different species had contributed resources, technology, and personnel to the ambitious goal of restoring Earth's devastated biosphere. Not for colonization, the planet would remain a memorial to human sacrifice, but as a symbol of what cooperative effort could accomplish. Kalthara walked through Central Park, where Federation engineers from the silicon-based Crystalline Collective were working alongside organic specialists from the aquatic depth dwellers, to restore the complex ecosystem that had once thrived here. The irony wasn't lost on him. Species that had never met humans were dedicating their lives to preserving human heritage. Strategic analyst Kale Thara, the voice belonged to Dr. Morvanian, a researcher from the telepathic harmony species. She approached through the reconstructed trees, her elongated form moving with the graceful deliberation characteristic of her people. "Doctor, how are the memorial archives progressing?" "Better than expected. We've recovered data storage devices from 17 major human cities. The cultural records are extensive." Her mental voice carried emotional undertones that her species rarely shared with non-telepaths. "I wanted to ask you about something we discovered in the Detroit ruins." Kale Thara's mandibles tightened involuntarily. Detroit was where his nightmares had begun, where human children had first shown him the true cost of conquest. "What kind of discovery?" Dr. Morvanian activated a portable holographic display, showing the interior of what appeared to be an underground facility. "We found this beneath one of the subway stations your unit fought through. It's a human archive facility, completely intact." The images showed rows of data storage systems, but also something more personal. Walls covered with photographs, documents and artifacts from human civilization, children's drawings, wedding photographs, scientific achievements, artistic creations. A comprehensive record of what humanity had been before the war. "There's something else," Dr. Morvanian continued. "The facility was designed to survive planetary bombardment. The humans built this place specifically so their cultural heritage would outlast their species." Kale Thara studied the images, noting the sophisticated preservation systems and the careful organization of materials. They knew they were going to lose, not just lose. They knew they were going to be extinct, but they wanted their culture to survive even if they couldn't. Dr. Morvanian's mental voice carried a note of something approaching awe. "Strategic analyst, these humans planned their own extinction as part of their resistance strategy." The implications hit Kale Thara like a physical blow. He had always assumed that human resistance was born from desperation, that their extreme tactics were the result of facing impossible odds. But this archive suggested something far more sophisticated and disturbing. "They wanted us to find this," he said quietly. "That's our assessment as well. The facility's location directly beneath the subway system where you fought ensures that any serious archaeological survey would discover it. But there's more." Dr. Morvanian led him deeper into the park, where Federation xenobiologists were attempting to recreate the complex relationships between Earth's flora and fauna. Their destination was a temporary research station built around another human artifact, a massive memorial wall covered with names. "We found similar archives in every major city," Dr. Morvanian explained. "Thousands of them, actually. The humans spent the entire war documenting their civilization and hiding those records in places where survivors would eventually find them." Kale Thara approached the memorial wall, reading the names of humans who had died during the Dominion invasion. But mixed among the human names were others: Zephyrian soldiers, crystalline collective personnel, depth dweller scientists, Federation beings who had died during the restoration project. "They added our names to their memorial," he whispered. "More than that, they left instructions for us." Dr. Morvanian activated another holographic display, this one showing human text translated into Federation standard. They called it the Final Testament, a comprehensive guide for building the kind of galactic civilization they had hoped to join. The documents were extraordinary. Detailed analyses of interspecies cooperation, frameworks for voluntary governance, economic models based on mutual benefit rather than exploitation. The humans had spent their final months not just fighting for survival, but designing the future they wanted their deaths to create. They planned all of it, Kale Thara realized. The resistance tactics, the psychological warfare, the cultural seeding through galactic communication networks. Everything was designed to force us to evolve into something they could approve of. The Final Testament confirms your analysis. They explicitly state that their goal was not to defeat the Dominion, but to transform it into what they called worthy inheritors of galactic stewardship. Kale Thara felt the last pieces of his understanding click into place. The humans hadn't been desperate defenders making impossible choices. They had been strategic planners executing a multi-generational scheme to reshape galactic civilization. Their own extinction was not a failure to be mourned, but a calculated sacrifice designed to achieve objectives they valued more than species survival. "They played us perfectly," he said, with something approaching admiration. "Every aspect of their resistance was calculated to exploit our psychological and cultural vulnerabilities. They turned our conquest into their victory by forcing us to become the civilization they wanted to exist." Dr. Morvanian's mental voice carried complex harmonics of respect and unease. "Strategic analyst, there's one more thing you need to see." She led him to a final holographic display, this one showing a recording that had been found in every human archive. A simple message from what appeared to be a representative group of human leaders, recorded during the final days of their resistance. The human speaker was a middle-aged female with the distinctive features of their species. Her words, translated into Federation standard, carried a message that recontextualized everything Kael'thera thought he understood about the war. "To the beings who will find these records," the human said, "we want you to know that we forgive you. We understand that you came to our world believing you were bringing civilization to primitives. We recognize that your intentions were not malicious, even though your methods were destructive." Kael'thera watched in stunned silence as the human continued. "We also want you to know that our resistance was not born from hatred, but from love. Love for the galaxy you represent and hope for what it could become. We chose to sacrifice our species because we believed that our deaths could inspire you to become worthy of the power you wield." The recording showed other humans in the background, including some Kael'thera recognized from combat encounters. They had been fighting and dying while simultaneously planning for a future they would never see. "We leave you our culture, our knowledge, and our dreams of what galactic civilization could accomplish. We trust you to build something beautiful from the ashes of our world. Make our sacrifice meaningful by becoming the benevolent shepherds of the galaxy that we always hoped you could be." The recording ended with images of restored Earth landscapes, showing what the planet had looked like before the war. It was a gift and a challenge. "Here is what we were, now show us what you can become." Dr. Morvanian's telepathic voice was barely a whisper. "They loved us, strategic analyst. Even while we were killing them, they loved what they believed we could become." Kael'thera stood in the restored park, surrounded by the evidence of unprecedented cooperation between species that had once been conqueror and subject, and understood that the humans had achieved something beyond victory or defeat. They had achieved transformation, not just of their enemies, but of the very concept of conflict itself. The Federation existed because humans had believed it was possible. The cooperation between former enemies was real, because humans had trusted that beings capable of conquest were also capable of growth. The restoration of their world was happening because they had faith that their destroyers could become their inheritors. Looking up at the sky where ships from dozens of worlds moved freely through space that had once been restricted to Dominion vessels, Kael'thera realized that the humans were still winning their war. Every act of voluntary cooperation, every choice to build rather than conquer, every moment of peace maintained through shared values rather than shared fears, was another victory for the species that had died to make it possible. The haunting was over. The humans had stopped visiting his dreams because their work was done. They had forced the galaxy to become worthy of their sacrifice, and now they could rest in the knowledge that their deaths had created something beautiful. Their true monument wasn't the restored biosphere of Earth or the memorial archives scattered across the galaxy. It was the transformation of an empire of conquest into a federation of hope, and that monument would last forever. 20 years after the Earth campaign, Kael'thera received an invitation that would have been impossible under the Old Dominion. A request to speak at the first galactic university, established on the neutral world of Haven Prime as a joint project between 43 different species. The university's founding represented everything the humans had died to create. Species that had never trusted each other were now sharing their most advanced knowledge freely. Former enemies were collaborating on research projects that benefited all participants. Young beings from across the galaxy were learning together, building friendships that would define interspecies relations for generations to come. Kael'thera stood before an auditorium, filled with students representing dozens of worlds, their varied forms creating a living demonstration of galactic diversity. He had been invited to deliver the inaugural lecture in a new course called The Ethics of Power, a subject that would have been considered dangerous, radical, thinking under imperial rule. 20 years ago, he began, I participated in what we thought was the conquest of a primitive world. Today I want to tell you why that conquest was actually the moment when civilization truly began in our galaxy. The students listened, with the intense attention that young minds brought to stories that explained their world. Kael'thara could see representatives of species that had been enemies for millennia, sitting side by side, united by their shared commitment to learning from the past. The humans taught us 3 fundamental lessons about power, he continued. First, that power without wisdom is destructive. Second, that wisdom without compassion is meaningless. And third, that true strength comes from choosing to limit your own power for the benefit of others. A young crystalline student raised a multifaceted appendage. Strategic analyst, our history courses teach us that humans were technologically primitive. How could they teach advanced civilizations anything about power? Kael'thara smiled, an expression that had taken years to master, after the facial reconstruction surgery that allowed him to interact more easily with species that found his natural mandibles intimidating. Technology is just one expression of intelligence, he replied. The humans had something more valuable, the moral intelligence to understand that some victories cost more than defeats, and that some principles are worth dying for. He activated the holographic display system, showing images from the restored Earth archives, pictures of human families, scientists, artists, and ordinary citizens who had chosen extinction over submission. Every human who died during our invasion made a conscious choice. They could have surrendered, could have accepted Dominion rule in exchange for survival. Instead, they chose to sacrifice their lives to teach us that conquest without consent is ultimately impossible. A young depth-dweller student's aquatic voice bubbled through the translation system. But didn't their sacrifice just prove that primitives couldn't adapt to superior governance? Their sacrifice proved that no governance is superior if it requires the destruction of the governed, Kael'thara corrected gently. The humans showed us that true leadership means inspiring others to choose cooperation, not forcing them to accept domination. He changed the display to show current images of the Federation, independent worlds choosing to work together, former enemies collaborating on peaceful projects, young beings like his students building relationships that transcended the conflicts of previous generations. This is what human sacrifice created, not defeat for the Dominion, but transformation into something worthy of the power we wielded. They forced us to evolve from conquerors into gardeners, from rulers into servants of galactic flourishing. An elderly professor from the Harmony Collective raised a graceful appendage. Strategic analysts, some scholars argue that human tactics could be adopted by any species facing superior force. Are we creating a galaxy where every conflict escalates to mutually assured destruction? It was a question that had haunted Federation planners for years. The human example had indeed inspired other species to adopt extreme resistance methods. But something unexpected had also happened. The threat of human-style resistance had made aggressive species much more cautious about starting conflicts in the first place. The humans didn't just teach the galaxy how to resist conquest, Kael'thara explained. They made conquest itself economically and morally impossible. When every potential victim is willing to accept total destruction rather than forced submission, aggressors have to find other ways to achieve their objectives. He displayed economic data showing the growth of voluntary trade agreements, peaceful arbitration treaties, and cooperative development projects throughout the galaxy. Voluntary cooperation has become more profitable than forced submission, because voluntary cooperation doesn't require constant military expenditure to maintain. A young student from the newest Federation member species, the former Catherian Empire, stood to speak. My grandparents were trained as soldiers in preparation for war against the Dominion. They tell stories about planning invasion fleets and conquest strategies. But I can't imagine wanting to conquer other beings. Why did that seem like a good idea to previous generations? Kael'thara felt a deep satisfaction at the question. This was exactly what the humans had died to create. Generations that found conquest not just impractical, but incomprehensible. Your grandparents lived in a galaxy where resources were scarce, knowledge was hoarded, and security came from controlling others. The humans showed us how to create abundance through sharing, security through cooperation, and strength through voluntary association. He changed the display one final time, showing the memorial gardens that now existed on dozens of worlds throughout Federation space. Each garden contained samples of Earth's restored biosphere and copies of human cultural artifacts. But they also represented something more: the commitment of dozens of species to preserve the memory of beings they had never met but whose sacrifice had transformed their lives. These memorials aren't just honoring the dead, Kelthara continued. They're celebrating the birth of a new kind of galactic civilization, one based on human values, the dignity of choice, the power of sacrifice for shared principles, and the understanding that true victory means creating a universe where everyone can flourish. A very young student, barely old enough for interstellar education, raised her appendage with the earnest curiosity that characterized her species. Strategic analyst, do you think the humans would be happy with what we've built? Kelthara paused, remembering the faces that had haunted his dreams for so many years. The smiling human female who had triggered the explosive vest. The children who had chosen death over surrender. The leaders who had planned their species' extinction as part of a strategy to reshape galactic civilization. I think they would be amazed, he said finally. They sacrificed their lives hoping that their example might inspire some positive change. Instead, they inspired a complete transformation of galactic civilization. We didn't just become better, we became something entirely new. He looked out at the diverse faces before him. Beings from worlds that had once been enemies now united in their commitment to learning and growth. But more importantly, I think they would be proud of you. You're the generation that inherited their sacrifice and chose to build something beautiful with it. You're proving every day that their faith in our potential was justified. As the lecture ended and students began filing out in mixed groups that would have been impossible under Imperial rule, Kelthara reflected on the strange journey that had brought him to this moment. He had started as a soldier trained to conquer and control. The humans had forced him to become something he never expected. A teacher dedicated to ensuring that future generations understood the true cost of power and the greater value of wisdom. Walking through the university's gardens, where plants from dozens of worlds grew together in carefully tended harmony, Kelthara felt the presence of human memory in a new way, not as haunting reminders of his failures but as guiding spirits celebrating the success of their ultimate strategy. The humans had won completely. They had transformed their destroyers into their inheritors, their conquerors into their disciples. The galaxy they had dreamed of but never lived to see was becoming reality in the relationships between species that chose cooperation over conquest, understanding over domination, growth over control. Standing beneath alien stars that now shone on a universe at peace, Kelthara understood that the humans would never truly be extinct, as long as their values continued to guide galactic civilization. They lived on in every choice to cooperate rather than compel, in every decision to build rather than conquer, in every moment when former enemies chose to become friends. Their sacrifice had created not just a memorial to their deaths, but a monument to the power of love to transform even the most impossible circumstances. They had loved their enemies enough to die so those enemies could become something worthy of that love. And in doing so, they had achieved the most complete victory in galactic history. They had made the universe itself a better place by leaving it. The haunting was finally over. The healing had begun, and the humans, in their own way, had come home at last to a galaxy that finally deserved their sacrifice.